On a grey June morning in 2023, news broke that would mark the end of an era. After 15 years of ownership, King Charles III announced he would not renew the lease on Llwynywermod, the Welsh farmhouse that had been his personal sanctuary. The three-bedroom stone cottage in Carmarthenshire, once a humble coach house, had witnessed the transformation of a prince into a king. But its story begins not in the 21st century but centuries earlier, in the mists of medieval Wales, with a family connected to one of England's most notorious queens. This is the story of Llwynywermod, a Welsh estate that rose from obscurity to become a royal residence, only to return once more to silence. Llwynywermod. Even the name carries the weight of Welsh history, pronounced with that distinctive double L sound that marks it as authentically Celtic, Llwynywermod. The translation reveals layers of meaning. Grove of wormwood, evoking images of ancient medicinal herbs growing wild in the valleys of Carmarthenshire. This is not a palace in the traditional sense, not a Buckingham or a Windsor. This is something more intimate, more connected to the land itself. The estate sits just outside the boundaries of the Brecon Beacons National Park, in that liminal space where cultivated farmland meets wild Welsh moorland. 192 acres of rolling hills, ancient stone walls and pastures where sheep have grazed for centuries. The nearest village is Midfai, a settlement known throughout Wales for its legendary physicians, the physicians of Midfai, whose herbal remedies were recorded in medieval manuscripts. The nearest railway station is Landovery, just 2 miles distant, that Victorian engineering achievement that connected rural Wales to the wider world. To understand how this remote Welsh farmhouse became a residence fit for the heir to the British throne, we must journey back through centuries, to a time when Wales was not yet fully integrated into the English crown, when the Tudors were yet to rise, and when a family named Williams first laid claim to these lands. The earliest recorded history of Llwynywermod takes us to the 13th or 14th century, that turbulent period when Wales was gradually being absorbed into the English realm following the conquest by Edward VI. The owner of the estate was William Williams, and here the story takes a fascinating turn. This William Williams was no ordinary Welsh landowner. He was a relative of Anne Boleyn, the woman who would become the second wife of Henry VIII and mother of Elizabeth the Fene. Think about that connection for a moment. This remote Welsh estate had bloodlines that connected it to the very woman whose marriage would trigger the English Reformation, the break with Rome, and the transformation of English religious and political life. How exactly were the Williams family related to Anne Boleyn? The genealogical records are frustratingly incomplete, as they often are for this period, but the connection was significant enough to be recorded and remembered through the centuries. Perhaps they were cousins through the Boleyn family's own Welsh connections. The Boleyns, despite their rise to prominence in the English court, had their own roots in trade and minor gentry. Or perhaps the connection came through Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, whose family had extensive networks throughout Britain. What we do know is this: the Williams family held Llwynywermod through centuries of tumult. They survived the Wars of the Roses, that bloody conflict between York and Lancaster that tore England apart in the 15th century. They navigated the religious upheavals of the Reformation. They held their lands through the English Civil War, when Wales was largely royalist, supporting Charles I against Parliament. Through all of this, Llwynywermod remained in Welsh hands, a testament to the family's ability to adapt, survive, and maintain their position. But the true golden age of Llwynywermod began in the early 19th century, when the estate passed into the hands of a family whose name would become synonymous with military distinction and Welsh landed gentry, the Griffies-Williams. The year was 1815. Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo, ending 2 decades of European warfare. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted, her treasury depleted, her people worn by years of conflict and economic hardship. Yet for some, particularly those who had profited from war contracts, government service or strategic investments, this was a time of opportunity. George Griffies-Williams was one such man. On an autumn day in 1815, George Griffies-Williams received news that would transform his family's status forever. He was to be created a baronet, joining that peculiar English institution, a hereditary title that conveyed status and prestige, but not membership in the peerage itself. Baronets occupied a curious position in the British class system, above mere gentlemen, below the nobility, but possessing the crucial prefix Sir that marked them as belonging to the upper reaches of society. With this new dignity came the need for an appropriate seat. George Griffies-Williams chose Llwynywermod and immediately set about transforming it from a comfortable but modest manor into something worthy of a baronetcy. The exact details of his renovations have been lost to time, but we can imagine the construction crews, the Welsh stonemasons and carpenters, the procurement of materials from across Wales and England. The estate was expanded, new buildings added, gardens laid out in the fashionable style of the early 19th century. The timing was significant. This was the era of the Regency, when the Prince Regent, later George IV, was remaking Windsor and Brighton in his own lavish image. Throughout Britain, the upper classes were building and rebuilding, creating country houses that expressed both their wealth and their taste. But in Wales, there was an additional dimension. Welsh landowners like the Griffies-Williams family were asserting their identity, proving that Wales could match England in refinement and cultivation while maintaining its distinct character. And so Llwynywermod became the seat of the Griffies-Williams baronets, a designation that carried weight in rural Carmarthenshire. The family now had status, land, and most importantly, the prospect of dynastic continuation. The baronetcy would pass from father to son, each generation carrying forward the family name and honour. 20 years after George Griffies-Williams received his baronetcy on a spring day in 1800, 15 years before his grandfather's elevation in fact, a child was born at Llwynywermod who would carry the family name to heights previously unimaginable. His name was Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams, and his life would span almost the entire 19th century, taking him from the green hills of Wales to the heat and danger of British India, from the quiet of country life to the roar of battle. Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams grew up in the most privileged circumstances rural Wales could offer. The youngest son of a baronet's family, he would have received the education befitting his station, classics at home from a tutor, then likely a public school education, and finally training for his chosen career. But unlike his elder brother, who would inherit the baronetcy and the estate, Watkin needed a profession. For younger sons of the gentry, the options were limited but honourable: the church, the law, or the military. Watkin chose the military, and not just any military service. He chose the British Indian Army, that extraordinary institution that allowed Britain to control a subcontinent with a relatively small number of British officers commanding Indian troops. This was not a choice made lightly. Service in India meant years, possibly decades, far from home. It meant exposure to tropical diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy action ever did. It meant loneliness, hardship, and the constant possibility of death in some remote outpost thousands of miles from Wales. But it also meant opportunity. An officer in the Indian Army could make his fortune through prize money, could rise through the ranks based on merit and bravery, could return home a general with a pension and glory. For an ambitious young Welshman in the 1820s, India represented possibility. We can imagine young Watkin's departure from Llwynywermod. Perhaps it was a foggy morning in spring, the kind where the mist clings to the valleys, and you can barely see the outline of the Brecon beacons in the distance. His family would have gathered, his father the baronet, his mother, his elder brother who would inherit, his sisters. The carriage would have been loaded with his trunk containing his uniforms, his books, his personal effects. The journey would take weeks, first to London, then by ship around the Cape of Good Hope to Bombay or Calcutta, then onward to whatever regiment he had been assigned to. The India that Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams arrived in was at a crucial juncture in its history. This was the era before the Mutiny of 1857, when British control seemed secure, but was in fact resting on increasingly unstable foundations. The East India Company still nominally ruled, though increasingly under the supervision of the British government. British officers like Watkin were not just soldiers. They were administrators, diplomats, and representatives of British power in a vast and complex land. Watkin served with distinction. The exact battles and campaigns he participated in are not fully recorded, but we know he rose steadily through the ranks, eventually achieving the rank of general. This was no small accomplishment. The officer corps of the British Indian Army was highly competitive, filled with ambitious men from across Britain seeking glory and advancement. To rise to general rank required not just bravery in battle, but administrative skill, political acumen, and the ability to command respect from both British officers and Indian soldiers. Throughout his years in India, Watkin would have experienced the subcontinent in all its complexity. He would have witnessed the ancient cities, the teeming bazaars, the magnificent Mughal architecture gradually falling into decay as British power superseded the old order. He would have learned Hindustani, perhaps Persian, the languages necessary for an officer to communicate with his men. He would have attended the social functions of British India, the balls and dinners where British society recreated a version of home in the midst of a foreign land, where young officers danced with the daughters of civil servants and traders, where reputations were made and broken over whiskey and gossip. And perhaps, on quiet evenings in some distant cantonment, with the sun setting over the Indian plains and the heat finally beginning to dissipate, General Griffies-Williams thought of home, of the green valleys of Carmarthenshire, of Llwynywermod, with its stone walls and Welsh sheep and the sound of rain on the roof, of a world utterly different from the one he inhabited, but one that remained his in a fundamental way that India, despite all his years of service, never quite would be. In 1877, after more than 50 years of service to the British Empire, General Sir Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams died. He was 77 years old, an impressive age for someone who had spent so much of his life in the disease-ridden garrisons and battlefields of India. With his death, the Griffies-Williams baronetcy passed to his elder brother's son, who became the third baronet. But time was running out for the line. The third baronet had no sons, and when he died, the baronetcy became extinct. This is a common story in British aristocratic history. Titles that once seemed secure, that carried the promise of perpetual continuation, simply end because of the demographic accident of no male heirs. But the loss of a baronetcy, while significant for family pride, did not necessarily mean the loss of the estate. Llwynywermod continued to be inhabited by the descendants of the Griffies-Williams family, though no longer could they claim the title Sir. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Llwynywermod witnessed transformations that mirrored the changes sweeping through all of Britain. The great Victorian era of confidence and expansion was ending. The Edwardian period brought new anxieties: industrial unrest, the rise of labour, the growing threat from Germany. The First World War shattered the old order completely. Thousands of young men from Wales, including many from Carmarthenshire, marched off to die in the trenches of France and Flanders. The landed gentry, already weakened by agricultural depression and rising taxation, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. The main house at Llwynywermod, the grand 13-bedroom country house that the Griffies-Williams family had built to reflect their baronetcy, began to show signs of neglect. Maintaining such a property required money and staff, both of which were increasingly scarce in the interwar period. The 1920s and 1930s saw estate after estate across Britain being sold, subdivided, or simply abandoned. The great country house era was ending, killed by taxation, social change, and the catastrophic loss of life in 2 world wars. By the mid-20th century, the main house at Llwynywermod had fallen into ruin. The roof leaked, then collapsed entirely in sections. Windows were broken by storms and never repaired. The elegant rooms where once the Griffies-Williams baronets had entertained the leading families of Carmarthenshire gradually filled with debris and decay. Nature began to reclaim what had been built with such care a century and a half earlier. Ivy grew over the walls, grew over the door. Rain penetrated the interior, causing plaster to fall and wood to rot. The house was becoming a shell, a ghost of former grandeur. But the coach house survived. This was the irony. The secondary building, the one built to house carriages and perhaps accommodate coachmen and grooms, proved more durable than the main residence. Its simpler construction, its lower profile, its more modest ambitions, meant that it weathered the decades of neglect better than the grand house. The thick stone walls, built by Welsh masons who understood the local climate and materials, remained solid. The slate roof, though requiring occasional maintenance, held firm against the Welsh weather. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, Llwynywermod existed in a kind of limbo. The estate was still owned by descendants of the Griffies-Williams family, but it was no longer a baronetcy seat, no longer a centre of social life. The land continued to be farmed, as it had been for centuries. Sheep grazed the pastures. The seasonal rhythms of rural Wales, lambing in spring, shearing in summer, the gathering of hay, the long dark winters, continued unchanged. The coach house was put to various uses. Perhaps it housed farm workers. Perhaps it was rented out to provide some income for the estate. Perhaps it stood empty for periods, waiting for a new purpose. What no one could have predicted was that this humble building would eventually become the Welsh residence of the future King of England. The story of how this transformation occurred begins in the early 21st century, with a prince who had long felt a deep connection to Wales and was looking for a way to deepen that connection through property ownership. Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, Duke of Rothesay, and bearer of numerous other titles, had a complicated relationship with Wales throughout his life. He received the title Prince of Wales in 1958 at the age of 9, but his formal investiture did not occur until 1969, when he was 20 years old. That ceremony at Carmarthenshire Castle was a carefully choreographed spectacle, designed to demonstrate the continuity of royal authority in Wales, while acknowledging Welsh identity and nationalism. Charles approached his role as Prince of Wales seriously. He learned Welsh, spending time at the University of Aberystwyth in advance of his investiture. He made regular visits to Wales throughout his adult life, meeting with Welsh organisations, supporting Welsh causes, and attempting to be more than a merely ceremonial figurehead. But there was something missing, a personal connection through property and residence. The prince owned no property in Wales. When he visited, he stayed at the homes of friends or in hotels. This was not unusual for royalty. Indeed, historically, the English monarchy's relationship with Wales had been characterised by conquest and control rather than residence and integration. But Charles wanted something different. He wanted a home in Wales, a place that would demonstrate his commitment to the principality and provide a base for his work there. The vehicle for this purchase was the Duchy of Cornwall, that ancient institution created in 1337 by Edward III to provide income for the heir to the throne. The duchy is a vast portfolio of land, property and investments spread across England and Wales, generating millions of pounds in annual revenue for the Duke of Cornwall. In theory, the duchy existed to ensure the financial independence of the heir to the throne. In practice, by the 21st century, it had become a sometimes controversial entity, exempt from corporation tax and operating with a level of opacity unusual for an institution so closely connected to the state. In November 2006, word began to leak that the Duchy of Cornwall was in negotiations to purchase a property in Carmarthenshire. The location was not disclosed at first, leading to speculation in the Welsh media. Some expected a grand estate, something comparable to the prince's residence at Highgrove in Gloucestershire. Others wondered if it might be a farm, given Charles's well-known interest in organic farming and sustainability. The reality, when it was revealed, surprised many. The property was Llwynywermod, the 192-acre estate near Mid-Fai, and the residence itself was the converted coach house, just 3 bedrooms, modest by any standards, certainly by royal ones. This was not a palace. This was barely even a country house. This was, quite deliberately, something else, an attempt at a low-key, sustainable, integrated approach to royal residence in Wales. The purchase was not completed quickly. Negotiations continued through the winter of 2006-2007. The duchy needed to conduct surveys, negotiate terms, and handle the inevitable media interest. Finally, in April 2007, the purchase was completed. The Duchy of Cornwall was now the owner of Llwynywermod, and the Prince of Wales had his Welsh home. But owning the property was just the beginning. The coach house, while structurally sound, needed significant renovation to make it suitable as a royal residence. This presented both opportunities and challenges. Charles had strong views on architecture and design. views that he had expressed publicly and sometimes controversially for decades. He believed in traditional building techniques, in using local materials, in creating buildings that harmonized with their surroundings rather than imposing alien aesthetic upon them. The architectural firm chosen for the renovation was Craig Hamilton Architects, a practice known for their sensitive approach to historic buildings and their commitment to sustainability. This was not to be a conventional royal residence renovation with all the usual luxury and expense. Instead, the brief was to create a comfortable but not ostentatious home that reflected the prince's values and respected the building's history and setting. The architects approached the project with care. The coach house was structurally sound but needed extensive work on its interior. The goal was to maintain the character of the building while making it comfortable and functional for 21st century living. This meant carefully removing later additions that had compromised the building's integrity, exposing original features where possible, and using traditional materials and techniques for all new work. Welsh stonemasons were employed, men who understood the local building traditions passed down through generations. They worked with Carmarthenshire stone, the same material that had been used in the original construction. Lime mortar was used rather than modern cement, allowing the walls to breathe and preventing moisture problems. Timber was sourced locally where possible, and when it needed to be imported, it came from sustainably managed forests. The roof received particular attention. The original slate roof was repaired using traditional techniques, with each slate carefully assessed and either retained, repaired, or replaced with matching slate. New slates were fixed using copper nails rather than modern alternatives, ensuring that they would last for generations. The chimneys were rebuilt where necessary, maintaining their original proportions and detailing. Inside, the layout was reconfigured to create 3 bedrooms, living spaces, and the necessary bathrooms and kitchen facilities for a comfortable modern home. But the reconfiguration was done with sensitivity to the building's original layout and features. Original beams were exposed and retained. Fireplaces were restored. Window openings maintained their original proportions. The interior design was entrusted to someone with a very personal connection to the project, Annabel Elliot, Camilla's sister. Elliot was an established interior designer with her own practice, and she approached the Llwynywermod project with an understanding of both the prince's preferences and the need to create a home rather than a showpiece. Elliot's design philosophy emphasized comfort, sustainability, and Welsh identity. The colour palette drew on the landscape, the greens of the valleys, the greys of the stone walls, the browns and golds of the moorland. Fabrics were sourced from Welsh mills where possible, including wool textiles that connected the house to the sheep farming heritage of the estate. Furniture mixed antiques with contemporary pieces from Welsh makers, but Elliot also needed to accommodate the specific requirements of a royal residence. There needed to be secure areas for official work. There needed to be space for the inevitable security staff. There needed to be proper facilities for staff who would accompany the Prince and Duchess on their visits. All of this had to be incorporated without overwhelming the modest scale of the building. The solution was to make use of the other buildings on the property. The estate included 2 ranges of former farm buildings, designated North Range and West Range, that adjoined the main coach house. These were converted into additional accommodation, guest cottages that could house staff when the prince was in residence but also be rented out as holiday accommodation when the property was not in use. This provided additional income for the estate while ensuring that the necessary support infrastructure was available when needed. The conversion of these ranges followed the same principles as the main house: traditional materials, sustainable techniques, sensitivity to the building's original character. Each cottage was made comfortable and attractive, with features that appealed to the holiday rental market: wood-burning stoves, views over the countryside, access to the estate's grounds. Throughout the renovation, there was an emphasis on sustainability that went beyond mere rhetoric. The heating system was designed to use renewable energy where possible. Water management systems were installed to minimize consumption and manage runoff. The grounds were managed using organic principles, free from chemical pesticides and fertilizers. This was entirely consistent with Charles's long-standing advocacy for environmental causes, but it also made practical sense in the Welsh context, where the land had been farmed traditionally for centuries. By the summer of 2008, the work was complete. After more than a year of renovation, Llwynywermod was ready to receive its royal residence. In a characteristically low-key manner, Charles and Camilla took up residence without any formal ceremony or public announcement. They simply arrived, as any owners might arrive at a weekend home, ready to begin using the property for its intended purpose. What was that purpose? Llwynywermod was conceived as a base for the prince's work in Wales. When he had engagements in South Wales, Mid Wales or West Wales, he could now stay at his own property rather than in hotels or imposing on friends. This allowed for a different kind of engagement with Wales, more sustained, more personal, less obviously ceremonial. The Prince and Duchess typically used Llwynywermod for several weeks each year, often during the summer months. Their visits followed a pattern. They would arrive quietly, usually by car rather than helicopter, maintaining the low-key character of the residence. During their stay, they would undertake engagements throughout the region, visiting farms, meeting with community organisations, touring businesses, attending Welsh cultural events. But they also used the property simply as a home. Charles would walk the estate, discussing farming matters with the estate manager. He would work in the study that had been created in the coach house, reading papers, preparing speeches, conducting the administrative work that consumes so much of royal time. Camilla would receive friends, read in the gardens, and pursue her own charitable work. They entertained, but on a modest scale, dinner parties for a dozen, rather than balls for hundreds. The local community's response to their royal neighbours was characteristically Welsh, respectful but not obsequious, interested but not intrusive. People in Mid-Fye and Landovery saw the Prince and Duchess occasionally in local shops or driving through the area. There was a certain pride in having a royal residence in the region, but not the overwhelming attention that might have occurred in England. This was perhaps exactly what Charles had hoped for, a place where he could be present without causing disruption, where his Welsh residence felt authentic rather than staged. The estate itself continued to function as a working farm. The 192 acres were let to local farmers who grazed sheep and cattle on the land. This maintained the agricultural character of the property and ensured that it remained integrated into the local rural economy, rather than becoming an isolated royal enclave. The estate generated income through both the farming lets and the holiday cottage rentals, helping to offset the costs of maintenance and staffing. Over the years, Llwynywermod hosted various events and visitors. Welsh cultural organisations held events on the grounds. School groups visited to learn about sustainable farming and traditional building techniques. The property became a showcase for the Prince's approach to heritage conservation and environmental sustainability, demonstrating that old buildings could be adapted for modern use without compromising their character. But there were also critics. Some in the Welsh nationalist movement saw Llwynywermod as another example of English colonialism, arguing that the Prince of Wales title itself was an imposition, and that the purchase of a Welsh estate by the Duchy of Cornwall reinforced rather than challenged that historical inequality. Others questioned whether the expense of maintaining a Welsh residence was justified, given how infrequently it was used, compared to the Prince's primary residences at Clarence House and Highgrove. These criticisms intensified in 2022 when Charles became king following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The Duchy of Cornwall passed to his son William, the new Prince of Wales, yet Charles continued to rent Llwynywermod from the duchy, paying rent to his son's estate for a property that had been purchased during his own tenure as Duke of Cornwall. This struck some observers as an odd arrangement, particularly given the complex and sometimes opaque financial structures surrounding royal properties. Charles, now King Charles III, faced a different set of circumstances. As monarch, his schedule was even more demanding than it had been as Prince of Wales. His primary residence was now Buckingham Palace, with Highgrove retained as a private retreat. Maintaining a third property in Wales, one that he had always used only occasionally, became increasingly impractical. The property required staff, security, maintenance, all expenses that had to be justified against actual use. In June 2023, the announcement came. King Charles would not be renewing his lease on Llwynywermod after that summer. After 15 years of royal association, the coach house at Mid-Fye would no longer serve as the king's Welsh residence. The decision was presented as practical and inevitable. The king simply would not use the property enough to justify maintaining it. There was no criticism of Wales or the property itself, merely an acknowledgement of changed circumstances. For those who had hoped Llwynywermod represented a lasting commitment to a different kind of royal presence in Wales, the news was disappointing. The property had demonstrated that royal residence didn't need to be grand or ostentatious, that it could be integrated into local communities, that it could embody values of sustainability and heritage conservation, but it had also demonstrated the limitations of that model. Royal schedules are demanding, security requirements are extensive, the infrastructure needed to support even occasional royal residence is substantial. In the end, practicality prevailed over symbolism. The future of Llwynywermod now lies with the Duchy of Cornwall, and, by extension, with Prince William, the new Prince of Wales. William has his own relationship with Wales, shaped by different experiences and values from his fathers. He and Catherine have made clear their commitment to Wales, choosing to make their primary residence at Windsor rather than in London, the better to be closer to all parts of the United Kingdom. But will they use Llwynywermod? Will they maintain it as a Welsh base, or will it be sold or put to another use? As of this writing, the future is uncertain. The property continues to be maintained by the duchy. The holiday cottages continue to be rented. The land continues to be farmed. But the coach house itself sits quiet, waiting to learn what role it will play in the next chapter of its long history. And what a history it has been. From the medieval period when it was owned by relatives of Anne Boleyn, through the glory days of the Griffies-Williams baronetcy, through the military career of General Sir Watkin Griffies-Williams, who served the British Empire in India, through the slow decline of the country house era and the ruin of the main house, through the survival of the coach house and its eventual conversion into a modest royal residence, Llwynywermod has witnessed and embodied larger forces of British and Welsh history. The story of Llwynywermod is, in many ways, a microcosm of the story of Wales itself. It speaks to Welsh identity and English power, to the complex relationship between the two nations that share the island of Britain. It speaks to the transformation of rural life over centuries, from feudal agriculture to modern sustainable farming. It speaks to the rise and fall of the British class system, from the creation of baronetcies in the early 19th century to their irrelevance in the 21st. It speaks to the changing nature of monarchy, from distant authority to attempted accessibility. Most of all, perhaps, it speaks to impermanence. The grand house built to reflect baronetcy status is now a ruin, while the humble coach house survives. The title that once seemed so important has been extinct for over a century. The royal residence that seemed to promise a new model of engagement with Wales has been given up after just 15 years. What endures is the land itself, the 192 acres of Carmarthenshire farmland, the stone walls, the sheep, the view toward the Brecon beacons. There is something deeply Welsh in this persistence of the land despite the transience of human ambition. Welsh culture has survived conquest, suppression, industrial transformation, and modern globalization. The Welsh language, once nearly extinct, is now experiencing a revival. Welsh identity remains distinct and vibrant despite centuries of political union with England. In this context, Llwynywermod's story seems fitting. The grand gestures fade, the baronetcy, the country house, even the royal residence. But the place remains, shaped by human activity but never entirely defined by it. If you visit Llwynywermod today, or rather, if you drive past it, for it is not open to the public, you will see a collection of stone buildings set in gently rolling farmland. In winter, with rain sweeping across the valley and mist obscuring the hills, it looks like countless other Welsh farms, the kind of place you might pass without a second glance. In summer, when the sun illuminates the stone and the fields are green, it has a quiet beauty that speaks to something essential about this landscape and the people who have lived in it. You might stop at Llandovery Station, that Victorian structure that still serves the railway line connecting South Wales to Mid Wales. You might walk into the village of Mid-Fai, where the legend of the physician still resonates in local memory. You might visit the Brecon Beacons National Park, whose boundary lies so close to the Llwynywermod estate, and in doing so, you would be experiencing the same landscape, the same quality of light and weather, the same essential character of place that drew William Williams in the medieval period, that sustained the Griffies-Williams baronets in the 19th century, that appealed to Prince Charles in the 21st. This is the real story of Llwynywermod, not the grand narratives of baronetcies and royal residences, important as those are. Not even the fascinating biographical details of figures like General Sir Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams, though his life deserves a full telling of its own. The real story is about continuity and change, about how places absorb and reflect the ambitions and values of those who inhabit them, about how the particular character of a landscape shapes and constrains what can be done there. In an age of globalization and homogenization, when places increasingly resemble each other, when the particular is sacrificed to the universal, Llwynywermod remains stubbornly itself. It could not be anywhere else. The stone comes from local quarries. The architectural traditions are specifically Welsh. The farming practices reflect centuries of adaptation to this particular climate and terrain. The very name, with its Welsh linguistic structure and reference to wormwood, roots the place in a language and culture that predate English dominance. This is what attracted Prince Charles, one suspects. For all the controversy that surrounded him, for all the criticism of his interventions in architecture and public affairs, Charles understood something important about place and identity. He understood that in a world of increasing uniformity, particularity matters. He understood that buildings should respond to their settings rather than imposing upon them. He understood that old techniques and traditional materials often work better than modern alternatives, not because they are old, but because they have been refined through generations of practice. The renovation of Llwynywermod embodied these values. It was not a project of restoration in the museum sense, freezing the building in some imagined historical moment, nor was it a project of modernization that would have stripped away historical character in favor of contemporary convenience. Instead, it was a project of continuation, taking a building that had served one purpose and adapting it for another while respecting its essential character. This approach stands in sharp contrast to much of what has been done to rural properties throughout Britain over the past century. How many farm buildings have been converted into holiday homes or permanent residences with no regard for their original character? How many have been stripped of their features, clad in modern materials, fitted with inappropriate windows and doors? How many have been demolished entirely, replaced with pastiche architecture that mimics historical styles without understanding their underlying principles? Llwynywermod demonstrates an alternative. Yes, it was expensive. Yes, it required skilled craftsmen and specialist materials. Yes, it took time and careful planning. But the result is a building that maintains its integrity while serving a new function, that respects its past while accommodating present needs, that will endure for future generations because it has been built and renovated according to sound principles. The irony, of course, is that after all this care and expense, the property is being given up by the very person who initiated its renovation. This might seem like failure, but perhaps it is more complicated than that. Charles's tenure at Llwynywermod achieved something important. It demonstrated that royal engagement with Wales could take a different form, that sustainability and heritage conservation were not just rhetorical commitments, but practical realities, that a modest approach to royal residence was possible. The fact that this model has not proven sustainable in the long term does not negate these achievements. Perhaps the lesson is that royal residence, like all forms of inhabitation, must respond to changing circumstances. What worked for Prince Charles in the 2000s and 2010s does not work for King Charles III in the 2020s. This is not hypocrisy or failure, it is adaptation, and Llwynywermod itself will adapt once more. Perhaps Prince William will find a use for it. Perhaps it will be sold to private buyers who will appreciate its character and maintain its features. Perhaps it will return to being simply a farmhouse, as it essentially was before its royal association. Whatever happens, the property will endure, shaped by this latest chapter in its history but not defined by it alone. If there is a philosophical conclusion to be drawn from the story of Llwynywermod, it is perhaps this: that our relationship with places must balance permanence and change, tradition and adaptation, respect for the past and openness to the future. The buildings that endure are those that are allowed to evolve, that serve real functions for real people, that adapt to changing needs while maintaining their essential character. The Griffies-Williams family's grand house failed this test. Built to impress, to demonstrate status, to embody a particular social position, it could not adapt when that social position became irrelevant. When there was no longer a baronet in residence, when there was no longer the money or staff to maintain it, when the social world it was built to serve had disappeared, the house had no function, and so it fell into ruin, its elaborate interiors exposed to weather, its grand rooms home only to decay. The coach house succeeded where the main house failed precisely because it was humble. Built for a practical purpose, it could adapt to new practical purposes. It could house farm workers, become holiday accommodation, transform into a royal residence, and potentially transform again into something else entirely. Its success lies in its flexibility, which in turn derives from its lack of pretension. There is a lesson here about sustainability that goes beyond environmental concerns to encompass cultural and architectural sustainability as well. The buildings that will survive into the future are not necessarily the grandest or most expensive, but those that can adapt to serve continuing human needs. The techniques that will endure are not necessarily the most high-tech, but those that work with local materials and conditions, that can be maintained by local craftsmen, that do not require expensive specialist intervention for every repair. This is what Prince Charles understood when he chose to renovate Llwynywermod using traditional techniques and local materials. It is what the original builders understood when they constructed the coach house from Carmarthenshire stone using lime mortar and local slate. It is what generations of Welsh farmers understood when they built stone walls that still stand centuries later, dividing fields and defining the landscape. And it is what has been forgotten in too much modern development, where buildings are designed for immediate effect rather than long-term durability, where materials are chosen for cost rather than appropriateness, where architectural fashion trumps climatic and cultural context. The result is a landscape filled with buildings that age poorly, that require constant maintenance, that feel alien to their settings, that will likely not survive to be the historic buildings of the future. Llwynywermod stands as a counterexample and a challenge. It asks, what if we approached all development with this same care? What if we always used the best local materials, traditional techniques, skilled craftsmen? What if we designed buildings to last for centuries rather than decades? What if we respected the character of places rather than imposing upon them? These are not merely nostalgic or conservative questions. They are profoundly practical questions about sustainability, about cultural continuity, about the kind of built environment we want to pass on to future generations. They are also questions about values. What do we prioritize? Short-term cost or long-term value? Fashionable novelty or enduring quality? Individual expression or collective tradition? The story of Llwynywermod does not provide simple answers to these questions. It is, after all, a story of a very particular property with very particular circumstances. How many people can afford to renovate buildings using specialist craftsmen and premium materials? How many properties have the royal connection that made Llwynywermod newsworthy? How many places have the natural beauty and cultural resonance of the Carmarthenshire countryside? But the principles demonstrated at Llwynywermod are applicable more broadly. The principle that buildings should respond to their settings. The principle that traditional techniques often work better than modern alternatives. The principle that skilled craftsmanship creates value that persists across generations. The principle that places have character that should be respected rather than overridden. These principles can be applied at any budget, to any property, in any location. As we stand in 2026, looking back on the story of Llwynywermod from medieval times to the present day, we can see it as a kind of microcosm of larger historical forces. The rise and fall of the Griffies-Williams baronetcy reflects the rise and fall of the British class system. The military career of General Sir Watkin Lewis Griffies-Williams reflects the story of British imperialism in India. The purchase and renovation by Prince Charles reflects contemporary concerns about sustainability and heritage. The decision to give up the property reflects the practical constraints that even royalty face in an age of austerity and scrutiny. But more than this, Llwynywermod's story reminds us that places have their own agency, their own character, their own way of shaping and surviving the ambitions of those who inhabit them. The land remains regardless of who owns it or what titles they bear. The stone walls endure regardless of architectural fashion. The view toward the Brecon beacons persists regardless of political change. This is perhaps the most Welsh thing about Llwynywermod. Wales itself has endured through conquest, industrial transformation, depopulation, and cultural suppression. It has maintained its distinctiveness despite everything. Llwynywermod, in its modest way, embodies this same quality of endurance. It is not the most impressive property in Britain. It is not the most historically significant. But it is authentically itself, rooted in its place, shaped by its history, adaptable to new circumstances, without losing its essential character. And so, as King Charles III departs, and the property enters a new phase of uncertainty about its future, we can be confident of one thing. Llwynywermod will endure. The coach house will continue to stand, its stone walls as solid as ever, its slate roof continuing to shed the Welsh rain. The land will continue to be farmed. The sheep will continue to graze. The wormwood will continue to grow wild in the valleys. Human ambitions come and go. Baronetcies are created and become extinct. Royal residences are acquired and relinquished. But the land abides, shaped by human activity but never entirely defined by it, always ready to adapt to whatever comes next while remaining fundamentally itself. This is the lesson of Llwynywermod, and it is a lesson that Wales has been teaching for centuries to anyone willing to learn. In a world of constant change, there is value in continuity. In an age of globalization, there is importance in particularity. In a time of disposability, there is wisdom in durability. Llwynywermod, the Grove of Wormwood, has witnessed centuries of British history from its hills in Carmarthenshire. It will witness centuries more, adapting and enduring, a testament to the stubborn persistence of place and the enduring character of Wales.